50 Cent is going all in on Rick Ross after reports claimed the rap mogul had millions in assets seized. As rumors of financial trouble spread, 50 wasted no time mocking his longtime rival online. Watch until the end because the evidence he uncovered could completely change how fans view Ross's empire. Picture this. You've built one of the most recognizable estates in all of hip-hop. A 109-room mansion sitting on over 200 acres in Fayetteville, Georgia. A property once owned by heavyweight boxing champion Evander Holyfield. Now rebranded and reimagined as a monument to your own success. You've got films shot on your grounds. You've got a car show that pulls in millions every year. You've called it the Promised Land, and you mean it. That is Rick Ross's reality. Or at least that's the version of reality he's been selling for years. Then the Georgia Department of Revenue sends over a piece of paper that cuts right through all of it. The state filed a tax execution against Ross alleging he owes nearly $65,000 in unpaid taxes. Delinquent liabilities that have been stacking up quietly and patiently since 2021. The state didn't rush. They let the interest breathe. They let the penalties pile on. And then, when the number had swelled enough to make headlines, they moved. And the internet noticed immediately. The original bill was $29,043 sitting there since 2021 like a parking ticket nobody bothered to deal with. But parking tickets become warrants and $29,000 tax debts become $65,000 tax execution. That's what happened here. Interest charges, penalties, collection fees, and the quiet accumulation of government patience all adding up to a moment that sent shockwaves through hip-hop social media and landed, of course, directly in 50 Cent's lap. Now, here's the thing you need to understand about why this hit as hard as it did. Rick Ross doesn't just make music. He is, by his own repeated insistence, a mogul, a boss, a man who lectures other people about wealth, about ownership, about assets over liability. He literally appeared in a Revolt series called Assets Over Liabilities where he shared his keys to staying rich, cutting his own grass and flying commercial. He has told anyone who would listen that he understands money in a way that most people around him simply don't. So, when the state of Georgia files a tax execution against that same man against his iconic estate, the crown jewel of his entire brand, the irony doesn't go unnoticed. The irony of Ross's estate being called the Promised Land while it sits at the center of his latest financial storm was not lost on anyone online. Not the blogs, not the comment sections, and especially not 50 Cent, who has been cataloging every crack in the Rick Ross armor since approximately 2008 and was not about to miss this one. 50 Cent got on Instagram. Of course, he did. 50 has frequently mocked Ross's business ventures and music career on Instagram. And this was the kind of moment he lives for. Not because he had to manufacture anything, but because the state of Georgia had done the work for him. The Promised Land, unpaid taxes, a tax execution, the man who calls himself the boss apparently not paying his bills. That's not a diss track. That's a press release. 50 Cent's approach to the Rick Ross situation isn't just trolling. It lands because of context. And the context here is 15 plus years of a feud that has made both of these men perpetually relevant to each other. Their feud has been on and off for over 15 years, marked by diss tracks, personal attacks, and a relentless back and forth that neither man seems willing to end. Probably because neither man actually wants it to end. It keeps them both in the conversation. It keeps the internet invested. And it means that every time something goes wrong in Rick Ross's life, there's a man already standing by with a phone and a caption ready to post. The tax execution dropped, the internet erupted, and 50 Cent, armed with years of archive tea, stepped up to the MIC. But to fully understand just how loud his mockery landed, and why the hip-hop internet took it as seriously as it did, you have to understand the full scope of what Rick Ross had built, how loudly he had been bragging about it, and exactly how long the government had been watching him let that $29,000 bill grow into something much more embarrassing. That's where this story actually starts. Not with the tax bill, not with 50 Cent's Instagram post. It starts years earlier with a man who turned himself into a brand, bought himself a palace, and told the world repeatedly, confidently, and sometimes aggressively that he had figured out something about money that very few people had. The Promised Land wasn't just a property name, it was a declaration, and declarations have a way of aging. William Leonard Roberts. I was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and raised in Carol City, Florida, a neighborhood that didn't offer much in the way of guaranteed futures. Growing up in Carol City, he witnessed financial hardship firsthand, and those early years created a hunger that never really left him. Before the rap career, before the mansions, before the Rolls-Royces and the Wingstop empires, he was working as a correctional officer, a fact that would later become the single most explosive weapon in 50 Cent's arsenal against him. But we'll get to that. What matters first is the trajectory, because the rise of Rick Ross is genuinely one of the more remarkable stories in hip-hop business history. His debut single Hustlin' sparked a bidding war among major labels in 2006, and he ultimately signed a multi-million-dollar deal with Def Jam Records under Jay-Z. His debut album Port of Miami debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 immediately. Not a slow burn, not a cult classic, #1 out of the gate, first album. That kind of entrance buys you a lot of confidence, and Ross wore every ounce of it. From that moment forward, the music was almost secondary to the brand construction happening around it. Ross didn't just want to be a rapper who was rich. He wanted to be a businessman who happened to rap. He founded Maybach Music Group in 2009, building a label that would house artists like Meek Mill and Whale, generating revenue streams that had nothing to do with his own album cycles. The label wasn't just a creative outlet. It was infrastructure. It was equity. It was the kind of ownership that turns artists into executives. The business moves didn't stop at music, not even close. One of Russ's most celebrated financial decisions was his investment in Wingstop franchises. He eventually owned over 25 locations across the country, with some estimates pushing that number past 30. Chicken wing shops, dozens of them, generating cash flow that doesn't care whether your album charted or not. In 2021, he made headlines for gifting his son a Wingstop franchise for his 16th birthday, a move so on brand for his entire persona that it felt scripted. Ownership, passive income, legacy. That was the message, and he repeated it constantly. Then there were the Spirits deals. Ross became an equity partner in Luke Belaya, not just a spokesperson, not just a face on a bottle, but an actual owner with a stake in the company's value. He launched Azuliato, his own tequila brand, stepping into one of the most profitable celebrity ventures available. His grooming line, built around his signature beard, became a genuine product line with retail traction. Rap Snacks put his face on bags of chips. Everything he touched got a piece of the brand, and every piece of the brand reinforced the same message. This man knows how to make money work for him. The crown jewel of all of it, though, the physical, tangible symbol of everything Ross claimed to represent, was the Promised Land. He purchased Evander Holyfield's former mansion in Fayetteville, Georgia for $5.8 million, and what he got was a 54,000 square foot estate. Some accounts call it 109 rooms sitting on over 200 acres of Georgia land. The estate has been featured in numerous films and generates additional income through production rentals. Scenes from Coming to America were shot there. His annual car show became a multi-million-dollar event hosted on those very grounds. The Promised Land wasn't just a home. It was a revenue-generating asset that happened to be where he slept. And Ross talked about it constantly in interviews, on podcasts, in videos posted from poolside or from inside one of his Rolls-Royces. He would look directly into cameras and explain with the calm confidence of someone who genuinely believed every word that he understood wealth in a way that his peers did not. He went on Patrick Bet-David's podcast, and when the topic of 50 Cent's finances came up, Ross was not subtle. He dismissed reports of 50 Cent's net worth suggesting the figure predated 50's bankruptcy filing. He claimed 50 lived in a two-bedroom apartment. He said, and this is the line that bounced around the internet, that 50 could wash the bottom of my yacht. He offered to buy 50 Cent's masters on camera on social media multiple times. The message was clear. Rick Ross had arrived at a level of financial legitimacy that left 50 Cent, in his view, irrelevant as a comparison. It was a bold declaration from a man standing on top of a 109-room mansion. But declarations made from that height have a long way to fall. And the Georgia Department of Revenue, it turned out, had been keeping receipts. Because here's the thing about the boss persona. It's expensive to maintain. The mansions cost money to run. Maintaining multiple estates carries serious costs through property taxes, insurance, staffing, and general upkeep. The cars depreciate, the parties cost, the lawsuits pile up. And when you've been telling the world you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a $29,000 doesn't feel urgent enough to deal with until the state of Georgia decides it's urgent enough, adds 4 years of interest and penalties to it, and files a tax execution that every blog in hip-hop publishes within 24 hours. The 2025 Georgia tax situation didn't arrive in a vacuum. Rick Ross and the tax authorities have been having this conversation, or more accurately, this one-sided argument for well over a decade. Back in 2012, the IRS made their first major move with a tax lien on his property. That was the opening shot, not the whole war, just the first volley, a signal that the federal government had taken notice of a gap between the wealth Ross was projecting and the taxes he was paying to reflect it. Then it got bigger, much bigger. By 2016, the situation had escalated significantly, leading Ross to settle an eye-watering $4.6 million bill in 2018 just to keep his assets safe. $4.6 million. That is not a parking ticket. That is not a clerical error. That is years of accumulation, years of the government watching income flow in and watching the corresponding tax filings not quite add up. And then finally, presenting a bill large enough to demand immediate attention. Ross paid it. He kept his assets. And you would think you would reasonably assume that writing a $4.6 million check to the IRS would make a man more careful going forward. But the story didn't end there. As another $1 million bill surfaced for the years 2013 and 2014. Even when he thought he was caught up, there was more. This is the pattern of someone who has complex finances, multiple income streams, and critically, a lifestyle that requires constant cash out the door. When you're generating money from music royalties, restaurant franchises, liquor equity, real estate rentals, touring, and endorsement deals all at once, keeping the tax picture clean is not simple. It requires the kind of financial discipline that runs directly against the personality Ross has built an entire career projecting. The business empire, as impressive as it looks from the outside, has also generated its own legal and financial friction over the years. In 2022, the U.S. Department of Labor fined Ross's family-owned company, Boss Wings Enterprises, over $100,000 for labor violations at 5 Mississippi locations. The investigation found employees were being illegally charged for uniforms and background checks, a finding that undercut the image of Ross as a benevolent boss who took care of his people. $100,000 in federal fines for how you treat your workers is not a good look for someone whose entire brand is built on the word boss. Then there was the car show lawsuit after his 2024 Rick Ross car and bike show in Florida. A paraplegic attendee named Darius Trotter filed a lawsuit claiming the event lacked promised wheelchair accommodations. The VIP pass holder, who had paid $500 for access, reportedly waited for hours in the summer heat without the accessible shuttles he'd been promised, while thousands of other attendees were transported without issue. Ross denied liability and pushed to have the suit dismissed. But the case added another thread to a growing legal tapestry that was starting to look less like isolated incidents and more like a systemic pattern. Every one of these situations fed a narrative that 50 Cent had been trying to establish for years, that the Rick Ross who existed on camera, poolside, and bearded and surrounded by luxury was a performance, that the numbers behind the curtain told a different story. 50 didn't need to make things up. He just needed to keep pointing at what was already there. And what was already there by 2025 was a tax execution filed against the promised land itself, the physical monument to everything Ross claimed to be. What started as a $29,043 bill back in 2021 had snowballed into a $65,000 debt. By the time Georgia filed for execution, the breakdown is almost poetic in its specificity. Interest charges of $10,576, penalties of $19,516, 8 collection fees of $5,808, and assorted other expenses pushing the total to $64,995. 21. That these are not the numbers of a man who is broke. They are the numbers of a man who is careless or who got bad advice or who assumed that a debt this small relative to his stated wealth didn't require immediate attention. Any of those explanations is possible. All of them are damaging to the brand. Because here's the math problem Ross couldn't solve publicly. He had been on camera claiming his net worth ran into the hundreds of millions. He'd said he spent $100 million in 6 months at one point. $70 million of that reportedly between a home and a private jet. He'd laughed at 50 Cent's reported net worth. He'd offered to buy 50's masters, and then the state of Georgia filed a tax execution for $65,000 that he apparently hadn't gotten around to resolving $65,000 against someone who claims to have spent $70 million on a house and a jet. The optics were terrible, and the internet treated them accordingly. The blogs ran it. The comment sections exploded. Twitter, or X, depending on how you're keeping score, went in. And 50 Cent, who has been treating the Rick Ross feud as a long-term content strategy since the Obama administration, saw his opening and walked through it with the confidence of a man who had been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. Because this wasn't just a tax debt. This was the promised land. Rick Ross's most prized possession. His most expensive brag. The physical embodiment of his entire "I got more than you" argument, now legally entangled with a government debt he hadn't bothered to pay. That's not just an L. That's a specific, targeted, perfectly shaped L that fits like a key into every lock 50 had been building for 15 years. To understand why 50 Cent's response to the tax situation landed the way it did, you have to understand who 50 Cent actually is in this dynamic. He's not just a rival rapper. He's not just someone with a grudge. 50 Cent is, by any honest accounting of his career over the last decade, one of the most gifted trolls in the history of social media. Not in a pejorative sense, in a genuinely skilled, tactically precise, relentlessly consistent sense. He understands that attention is currency, that controversy generates engagement, and that keeping an enemy relevant keeps you relevant. The Rick Ross feud isn't a distraction from 50's career, it is a pillar of it. The feud traces back to 2008, sparked by a perceived slight at the BET Awards at the time. 50 was at the height of G-Unit dominance, fresh off one of the best-selling rap debut albums in history, running with Dr. Dre and Eminem, culturally bulletproof. Ross, who had just arrived with Port of Miami, was still establishing himself. The look 50 allegedly gave him at the BET Awards, dismissive, unbothered, was the match. What followed was 15-plus years of gasoline. 50 went after Ross's identity. First, the Officer Ricky campaign, where he relentlessly mocked Ross's past as a correctional officer, contrasting it with the street kingpin persona Ross was selling in his music, was a masterclass in targeted character assassination. 50 posted multiple pictures of Ross in his police uniform, circulated documents, went on radio shows. He wasn't trying to win a rap battle. He was trying to dismantle the premise on which Ross's entire career was built. And while Ross survived it, largely by refusing to stop releasing music and eventually pivoting to a businessman identity that didn't require street credibility, the damage to his mythology was real and permanent in certain corners of the internet. Then 50 found a new angle: money, or rather the question of how much money Ross actually had versus how much he claimed. In February 2009, 50 appeared on the Ed Lover Morning Show with a copy of Rick's financial breakdown obtained during a child support case. These documents revealed that Ross's true financial status was far from the image he liked to portray at that point. The filing reportedly showed Ross claiming ownership of 3 cars and $45,000 worth of jewelry, numbers that raised obvious questions about where all the luxury in his videos was actually coming from, given that it seemed to suggest borrowed or rented assets rather than owned ones. That 2009 moment established the template for everything that followed. Every time Ross bragged about his wealth, which was constantly, 50 had a built-in counter-narrative ready to deploy. Not necessarily a factually devastating one, but an emotionally satisfying one for anyone who already doubted the Ross persona. And as the years went on, the feud evolved from pure mockery into something more sophisticated, a running commentary on the difference between talking about money and actually having it. 50 positioned himself as the guy who knew the difference. Ross positioned himself as proof that 50 didn't know what he was talking about. and the internet watched both men make their case endlessly across every platform available. The more recent rounds of this feud have been particularly combustible. In March 2025, 50 clowned Ross for being listed low in the lineup of the upcoming Millennium Tour, mocking him for appearing as a special guest beneath headliners and supporting acts including Bow Wow, Omarion, Trey Songz, Plies, Boosie, Ray J, and the Ying Yang Twins. He posted the tour flyer. He pointed to Ross's name at the very bottom. He captioned the post, "He not a surprise guest. He can't sell a ticket. LOL." Then in the comments, he dragged Drake into it, implying that the only songs Ross had that actually moved crowds were the ones featuring the Toronto rapper. Ross hit back as he always does. He got on Instagram and went at 50's record deal, questioning why 50 never renegotiated his contract with Interscope and Aftermath after Get Rich or Die Trying went diamond. He pressed on the Masters question, who owned them? Who was getting paid on the back end? He pointed at 50's unit studio facility in Shreveport, Louisiana, implying it was taking forever to complete because of funding issues. He mocked Tony Yayo. He threatened to buy 50's masters outright. He went on the PBD podcast and said 50 lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and that the shows and documentaries 50's name was attached to were just licensing his face for small paydays without real equity. The man who calls himself the boss does not back down easily. But then the Georgia tax execution dropped and 50 Cent had something better than anything he manufactured. He had a government document. He had an actual legal filing showing that the man who just offered to buy his masters hadn't paid a 5-figure tax bill on his most famous property for 4 years. The mockery that followed was by 50's Standard Surgical. 50 has frequently mocked Ross's business ventures and music career on Instagram. But this was different. This was 50 being handed ammunition. He didn't have to fabricate, shape, or exaggerate. The story was already fully formed. He just had to point at it, and the hip-hop internet, which had watched these two men go back and forth for the better part of 2 decades, erupted. Because the timing was so perfect, it almost felt staged. Russ had just been on a podcast laughing at 50's net worth. He just threatened to buy 50's masters. He just called himself the boss again in the context of a feud about who had actually figured out money. And then Georgia showed up to his front door with a tax execution. The punchline wrote itself. 50 Cent just read it out loud. So after all of it, the tax execution, the Instagram wars, the podcast appearances, the Masters threats, the Millennium Tour flyer, the car show lawsuits, the labor violations, what does the actual financial picture of Rick Ross look like in 2025 and into 2026? Because the question underneath all of 50 Cent's mockery, the question that gives his trolling its teeth, is a real one. Is the boss actually bossing, or has the gap between the persona and the reality been growing quietly for years? The honest answer is complicated, which is exactly what makes the story interesting. Depending on which source you trust, Rick Ross's net worth ranges from an estimated $45 million to $55 million on the conservative end to as high as $150 million to $180 million on the more favorable assessments. That's not a small range. That's a difference of over $100 million, which tells you a lot about how opaque Ross's actual financial situation is and how much of his wealth lives in assets, real estate, equity stakes, franchise ownership rather than liquid cash that's easy to verify or value. Ross's money is not sitting in a bank account. It lives inside a massive asset portfolio, real estate, restaurants, music rights, and brand equity. And that matters enormously in the context of a tax execution because the two things are not as contradictory as they might seem on the surface. A man can own a 109-room Georgia estate worth millions, hold equity in a spirits company, run over 24 fast food franchises, and still have a cash flow problem specific enough to create a delinquent 5-figure tax obligation. Assets and liquidity are different things. Net worth on paper and money available to cut a check today are not the same number. But that nuance doesn't play well on Instagram, and it certainly doesn't protect you from 50 Cent, who has never once let nuance slow down a good troll. What plays on Instagram is the image of the promised land. This enormous, legendary, personally branded estate that Ross has used as a backdrop for his entire mogul identity, now sitting at the center of a tax execution filed by the state of Georgia. The symbolism is overwhelming. The promised land mortgaged by delinquent taxes. The biggest boss behind on his bills. The man who offered to buy your master's apparently not paying his own property taxes. Russ, for his part, also made a move that complicated the financial picture further. He put his Southwest Ranches Florida mansion on the market for $6.5 million in late 2025. The property, a 14,000 square feet 6-bedroom estate in a gated community, had been purchased from former NBA star Amar'e Stoudemire for $3.5 million. The $6.5 million asking price represents nearly double what he paid, suggesting genuine appreciation and smart real estate positioning. His camp framed the sale as a strategic pivot, consolidating around his Georgia compound while freeing capital for new ventures, including a cryptocurrency platform called BitFortune he co-launched with Gamma. So, the narrative Russ was trying to build was one of active strategic wealth management, selling assets he no longer needed, deploying capital into emerging sectors, treating real estate as a liquid instrument rather than a trophy. He also announced his upcoming solo album Set in Stone in late 2025, suggesting he had no intention of pulling back from the spotlight or from the music industry. In Russ's telling, he was evolving, not struggling. He was making moves, not retreating. The tax situation was a footnote, not the headline. But 50 Cent in the comment sections and the blogs and the social media accounts that followed this feud with the dedication of sports fans was not interested in Russ's framing. 50's comments about Russ's massive estate and financial situation had already gotten back to Rosary, prompting retaliation. But this time the retaliation felt hollow in a way previous rounds hadn't. When Russ was throwing shade at 50 from a position of apparent financial strength, the back and forth felt competitive. When he was doing it while owing the state of Georgia $65,000 on the estate he was throwing shade from, the dynamic shifted and the broader hip-hop internet picked up on that shift. The Rick Ross and 50 Cent feud isn't just gossip. It's a reflection of hip-hop's competitive spirit, and both artists have used their rivalry to fuel their brands over the years. But brands need credibility to function, and credibility is exactly what a tax execution chips away at. Russ's brand is built on a very specific promise that he understands money, that is ahead of the game, that is the boss in a literal financial sense, not just a musical one. Every crack in that promise is a point for the other side. 50 Cent, meanwhile, was navigating his own financial evolution and doing it with considerably less public scrutiny than Russ. 50 reportedly filed for bankruptcy in 2015 after several financial setbacks, a fact Russ regularly deployed as ammunition. But the bankruptcy, paradoxically, became part of 50's story rather than the end of it. He emerged from it with Power on Stars, a growing TV production empire through G-Unit Film and Television, and a reputation for being more financially strategic than his image suggested. His net worth by most estimates sits around $100 million and by some measures growing. The question of who has won the financial argument between these two men is genuinely unanswerable because both of them exist in a world where perception and reality blur constantly, and where the public financial information available is almost never the full picture. What is clear is that their ongoing back and forth keeps both artists in the spotlight, proving that beefs are as much about marketing as they are about personal grudges. Every round of this feud generates millions of impressions, thousands of articles, and a renewed interest in both of their careers, catalogs, and brands. Neither man is walking away from it anytime soon. What the Georgia tax execution did more than anything else was hand 50 Cent a moment. Not a knockout, not a definitive proof of Russ's financial ruin. Just a moment, a perfectly timed, symbolically loaded, publicly documented moment where the most expensive brag in Rick Ross's arsenal, the promised land itself, became the subject of a government collection action for a 5-figure debt. In the court of hip-hop opinion, that's not just embarrassing. That's the kind of thing that gets reference for the next decade every time Rick Ross picks up his phone to post about how much money he has. And here's where the story lands in 2025 and into 2026, with both men still very much active, still very much in each other's orbit, and still very much performing for the same audience. Russ announced a new solo album and continued managing his car show empire from the Promised Land, which Georgia's tax execution notwithstanding remains in his possession. his selling the Florida mansion but keeping the Georgia compound, his launching crypto ventures, his still posting from poolside, still throwing shade at 50 Cent, still insisting that the boss narrative is intact. 50 Cent is still watching, still posting, still mocking Russ's business ventures and music career on Instagram, still waiting for the next crack to appear. Because that is the structure of this feud at this point. It doesn't need new incidents to fuel it because the old incidents keep compounding. The Officer Ricky stuff from 2009 still circulates. The child support financial documents still get referenced. The tax liens from 2012 still get listed when someone writes about Ross's financial history. And now, forever, the 2025 Georgia tax execution on the promised land joins that archive. Another piece of documentary evidence in 50 Cent's case that the Rick Ross you see on camera is not the full picture. Whether that case holds up, whether the boss is actually broke or just briefly behind on a bill, whether the mogul persona is real or manufactured, whether the empire is solid or leveraged to the hilt, that's a question neither Instagram nor a YouTube comment section can definitively answer. What they can do is keep asking it. And as long as they're asking it, both Rick Ross and 50 Cent stay relevant, stay in the conversation, and stay exactly where they want to be, at the center of hip-hop's most durable, most profitable, most genuinely entertaining ongoing argument about who actually has the money.